Well, today I want to look at the labor market and basically the minimum wage. Now, the minimum wage was begun in 1938. It was something like 20 cents an hour. It was raised during the next year and remained pretty flat. In fact, what I have is a little bit later I'll show you a chart that shows the history. But let's look at the minimum wage, and we're going to make the initial assumption that our labor market, which is supply and demand driven, and let's assume that it's a free market and wages are determined by the supply and the demand of labor. So we're going to look at this labor market, draw it out on a supply-demand diagram, and let's make the initial assumption that the labor market is in equilibrium. So we have a certain quantity of labor that's supplied at a certain wage level, and there's a certain demand for labor. Demand, of course, for labor is a derived demand. It depends on the demand for the goods and services that labor produces. And then there's a supply of labor, which operates in the same function as any other supply system. The higher the wage, the more people will come out of their closets and their dens to get jobs. So if we're at equilibrium, there's going to be a certain quantity, let's call it Q0, of labor being supplied that's being paid a wage, let's call it wage 0. Now, let's say in Congress there's all this pressure that says the wage that's the minimum wage, and this could be the minimum wage is in fact too low. Okay? So Congress gets together and they raise the minimum wage. They in effect create a price floor for the wage, and that minimum wage, let's say it's raised up here to W1, like that, and that's the new wage. Now you'll note that we have done nothing to change the demand for labor, nor the supply of labor. All we have done is we have forced a new price level or a price floor. The price cannot go below that now because Congress has set the minimum wage. So here's what happens. And let me dig out another couple of colors because this gets really exciting as we see what might happen to the labor market. So I've got my red, green, and blue markers. We'll see if they help us see what's going on. Okay, now remember, we started off at this level of employment. That's the employment level, folks. That's how many people have jobs. Now, when the labor price goes up, what happens to the quantity of labor supplied? Well, at that higher price, the law of supply says that more is going to be supplied. So now instead of just having that number of people wanting to work and then getting jobs, we now come up here and we have the quantity of labor supplied is increased. But wait, at that higher price, the demand for labor is going to be decreased. The employers are going to have a certain budget that they had for their labor, and they're not going to want to hire any more people. In fact, they have a tendency to lay people off, so the quantity of labor demanded is actually going to fall. Quantity is fallen. So now what happens? We end up having a surplus of labor but only that amount is going to be hired. That basically amounts to the new unemployment level because those people want to work, they're looking for jobs, they're just not finding them because only that amount happens. The actual loss of jobs is going to be that amount from Q0 down to quantity demanded will be the actual loss of jobs. Okay? So by raising the minimum wage above the equilibrium wage, the supply-demand theory says that we're actually going to make unemployment worse. Now, the neat part is, In reality, that's not quite what happens because there are other adjustments that come into the labor market. I have a friend who operates the Burger King, and as you may know, we recently had an increase of the minimum wage from $5.15 to $7.25, and that took place over a couple of years. And my friend who works the Burger King actually had to raise all his wage levels, even though he was currently paying above the minimum wage. He had to raise them up so that his workers were still being paid above minimum wage. He also gave himself a raise. And in order to pay for that raise, what did he do? He raised the price of a Whopper and a Whopper Jr. and all those other things he sold. He raised the prices proportionately. And you know what that is? That's inflation. Inflation is primarily driven by the wage rate in our country. Well, so what do you think about this? This is called the textbook model. And there are those forces that exist to lower the number of people employed, to raise the number of people who want to have a job, to exacerbate the unemployment by raising the price to this new higher minimum wage. Those forces are there. They do have a slight amount of impact, but there's also a resilience that's not fully explained by this simple model. Now, let me bring this up here. This is a picture of the minimum wage, and I'll try to hold it steady, the minimum wage history from 1938 until now. Now, you'll notice that the minimum wage, that's the blue line that keeps going up and up and up. That represents the nominal wage that is not adjusted for inflation. Now, I adjusted this red line, the red squares is the effect of inflation adjustment, on the minimum wage. Now you'll notice that the minimum wage beginning in about 1966 has basically been pretty flat when you adjust it for inflation. The highest minimum wage occurred, real minimum wage occurred from about 1966 until about 1980, and then we've seen a diminishing of the value of the minimum wage because of inflation. I adjusted this based on the Consumer Price Index, which is indexed at 100 for 1982-1983. So that's why it says that it's the constant $1982. So that's what's happened through the minimum wage historically. It began in 1938 and applied only to workers who are engaged in something to do with interstate commerce, because back then Congress sort of took the amendment, the Bill of Rights amendment that says, Congress can't do anything to a state unless, if it's related to a state. I forget the amendment number, but y'all know what it is. And that constrained the minimum wage to apply to very few jobs. Now the minimum wage applies to many more jobs throughout our country. You can look up minimum wage on Wikipedia if you like, and you can find out that other states have a larger minimum wage than the $7.25 an hour. Usually, if you want to keep your employees, you're going to pay them what they're worth, and that's quite often above the minimum wage. Well, I hope this very short exposition of the minimum wage will give you a little better feel for the minimum wage, the labor market, and basically how it works. Have fun.